Caribbean nations want $33 trillion and an apology from Europe for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. The 15-nation union known as CARICOM has developed a 10-point plan to negotiate a financial settlement with Britain, France, Spain and Denmark. But will Europe pay any attention? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, while sending formal letters to governments, Caribbean nations have been pressing for an apology and reparations for slavery. Earlier this year, The Guardian newspaper reported that King Charles's ancestors bought and used slaves on plantations in Virginia. A Buckingham Palace spokesman said the King takes the issue of slavery profoundly seriously. So will the Caribbean demands be effective?
$33 trillion. It's a big number, but that's the amount Caribbean nations, represented by a group called CARICOM, claim Europe should pay to atone for its part in the slave trade. So who is CARICOM? According to its website, CARICOM is the oldest surviving integration movement in the developing world. It's recognised by the UN and is made up of 20 countries, with 15 member states and 5 associated members. For international reconciliation, CARICOM established a 10-point plan to negotiate a financial settlement with the UK, France and Spain. After the Danish government apologised to Ghana for the slave trade, CARICOM says they must pay reparations too. The Dutch king apologised, but the English monarch has not, and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak advises us not to look back.
Trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward, and it's not something that we will focus our energies on.
So is apologising to those who suffered as a result of the transatlantic slave trade the best way to go forward, even if it means digging up the past?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us on Skype from Washington, D.C. is Alberto Vargas, economist and principal at the Brattle Group. In London is Esther Stamford-Cossey. She is reparations specialist and co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. Here in the studio with me is John Dower, a member of the Trevelyan family who paid reparations to Grenada. And Rafe Heydel-Mankoo is a historian, author and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum. Esther, to you first, do you believe reparations are correct, should be paid, and this is the way forward?
Yes, I do support reparations. However, the beginning of the conversation of reparations is not about payment. Compensation is only one aspect of reparations under international law, and many movements for reparations, including the International Social Movement for African Reparations, privilege guarantees of non-repetition and restitution as key remedies for reparations.
Alberto, the figure that has been in the media, trillions and trillions of dollars, this was all the work of your organisation. Just talk us through the process, how you came to these figures.
So we divided the calculation of the damages into 2 pieces. First, we sought to quantify the harms inflicted during the period when chattel slavery was carried out, and then the harms that followed the enslavement period. Within the harms during the period of slavery, the key part was pricing the stolen labor, or the foregone earnings, as we refer to them in the report. This took into account both stolen labor and the labor that would have existed had the lives of the enslaved not have been shortened because of slavery. We can go into further detail into other heads of damages, but we took into account also harms that are usually not considered in the economic literature, such as the value of loss of liberty, personal injury, mental pain and anguish, and gender-based violence. All of these were calculated based on contemporary instances of compensation for these kinds of damages.
Rafe, you believe Britain should not pay a single penny, is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, were we having this discussion in 1807, when Britain abolished the slave trade, I would absolutely be in favour of that happening. And indeed, of course, we saw the Anglican Church at that time making reparations into the Caribbean period. But it's not 1807, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since then. And we're talking about the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of slaves, 7 generations removed. And nobody has been able to effectively demonstrate to me in what way the modern population of the Caribbean have been disadvantaged by slavery. Now, in Alberto's report, they constantly draw comparisons with life expectancy in the UK compared to the Caribbean, with the GDP per capita in the UK compared to the Caribbean. A completely bizarre comparison. The real comparison should be with West Africa. And if you look at places like Benin, for example, which is, of course, where most slaves come from, life expectancy in Benin is 10 to 15 years shorter than in the Caribbean. The GDP per capita in Benin is $1,300 per year. It's over 10 times that in the majority of Caribbean nations. So in what way have the lives of the people today been disadvantaged by slavery?
We've seen the Dutch king apologise for the Netherlands' role in this shameful, shameful episode in human history. Do you think King Charles should now be apologising for Britain's role?
Nobody today has the right or ability to apologise for the sins of the past. You know, it goes back to biblical times. The sins of the father should not be meted upon the son. The apologies should have happened in the 19th century, and they did. Prince Albert in 1840 made an abject apology and was vociferous in his condemnation of slavery, and in fact was a leading voice. It was the first time that the monarchy ever became politicised on an issue, was in supporting the anti-slavery movement. That was the time for it. It's been done. It's not healthy. It's quite nihilistic, actually, to constantly browbeat ourselves. Britain has more than paid its debt for slavery.
Has it really? In all honesty, has Britain really paid its debt to these countries?
Not only did it spend 40% of its annual GDP in liberating the slaves, it expended vast resources through the Royal Navy.
But that was money that went to the slaveholders.
But the realpolitik was, if you wanted to get that through Parliament at the time, that was necessary. People have to realise you have to deal with what you have on the ground. But also, let's remember that the Royal Navy ended the international slave trade, including seizing American ships. The vast amount of resources that were spent on that, actually, many people think was equal to or greater than the profits made from the slave trade.
John, I want to bring you in. You're a member of the Trevelyan family. Your ancestors were slave traders. You've been on...
well, they owned plantations.
But they profited from the slave trade. Mm-hmm. Talk us through the journey you've been on, where you've been going and what you've been doing.
Well, in 2016, I read the UCL Legacies of Slavery database. And at that point, I discovered that the family had owned plantations in Grenada. This was a complete shock to me. My great-grandfather, CPT Trevelyan, was a Labour MP. I thought that we were on the side of the abolitionists. I thought we were on, naively, admittedly, that we were on the sort of right side of history, and I discovered that we weren't. And immediately I thought, we need to apologise for this. And that began a 7-year journey, which culminated in our journey to Grenada this February to apologise to the people of Grenada.
How was your apology received?
Generally well, I would say. There were detractors, there were protests, there were some robust questions, but I'd say generally I think we were quite well received. And thus has begun an interesting journey for me because my life's changed. I've sort of become a reparations campaigner in some ways, apart from my full-time job.
How did it feel when you saw the family name in these records?
Awful. I mean, I genuinely wasn't expecting it. My family say to me I was naive, but I really wasn't expecting it. And it turned on its head who I thought I was in some ways, you know, without being grandiose. It was quite a life-changing moment.
Social media is very powerful nowadays. You're active, you post. What kind of response do you get from people when you talk to them about what you're doing?
Twitter can be quite heated. We get quite a lot of negative comments on Twitter. Since we formed the organisation The Heirs of Slavery, which we formed just before the King was coronated this spring, there's been more. But I think generally, we're getting the word out. I think the conversation is becoming better received, but it's an ongoing conversation. It's a process, and I think it's probably going to get more heated.
Esther, I want to come to you. How do you feel about families like the Trevelyans getting involved now and trying to undo some of the damage that was done to people in the 1800s?
So, in terms of my feelings, I think it's important for those families that wish to engage in some degree of accountability. I do, however, think that there is a fine line between getting involved and supporting a movement and then usurping the agency and the self-determination and the dignity of affected communities. And one of the things that we have to recognize is the way in which the media works, the mass media works, the corporate mass media works, how those who are now gaining a lot of spotlight in the mass media are not actually amplifying the voices of the movements from below. Certainly, they are amplifying the voices of CARICOM nation states. However, CARICOM nation states did not suffer transatlantic enslavement. They did not suffer the crimes against humanity. They did not suffer genocide. It was the African peoples that were trafficked to those regions that did. And we are global, and our voices are not being heard. And this notion that somehow it's too late, every single generation from the time that we were kidnapped from Africa in the 1400s, we have been calling for repair, which is the true essence of the term reparations. However, as the United Nations report that was released today states, part of the problem why this has not occurred is because of a lack of political will to actually engage in repair processes and discourses from those who have been beneficiaries of enslavement and colonialism and the contemporary effects, and especially neo-colonialism today.
Esther, in the studio here is Rafe, who says that Prince Albert said sorry in 1840 and that should be enough. What would you say to Rafe?
Definitely not. I mean, African enslavement helped to create the West. And it's not just about what happened during chattel slavery. That was followed by colonialism and contemporary neo-colonialism. And the revolutionary uprisings that are happening in West Africa today are actually demonstrating that we are still being denied self-determination. Our leaders are still assassinated. We are still being denied the right to govern ourselves and shape our countries and our nations in our own people's interests. And were it not for Africa today, Europe would fall, because many of the companies registered on the London Stock Exchange that would be considered British companies are actually reaping the benefits of unjust enrichment that have been denied to African communities throughout the generations. So it is actually dishonest, ahistorical to claim that because an apology, so-called apology, was made, that should be it. An apology is just the beginning. That must be accompanied by material redistribution of ill-gotten gain and wealth and resources that continue to actually remain in the hands of those nations that were leading in actually the trafficking of African people.
Rafe, come back on that.
I'm sorry, but there's a great deal of historical ignorance here. Slavery did not build the West. If it was such an important part of the economies of European nations, then Portugal would have become the greatest power in the 19th century. Portugal was far and away the largest slave trading nation.
Maybe
of course,
the,
it was
maybe
an economic
the Brits were just a
it
bit
was an
better
economic
at it.
backwater. No, the amount of the British economy that was benefiting from the sugar trade, which was the main beneficiary of slavery, was comparable to barley and hops. Now, no one says that the beer brewing industry fueled the Industrial Revolution, that it fueled the British Empire. In 1770, only 3% of capital formation was devoted to slavery. It's a complete nonsense. And the problem is we have all of this false history being put forward by people who aren't historians or who are being deliberately disingenuous, and it muddies the water, and people who don't know it just take it as being true. Another point is, why should people in this country who were serfs in their former generations pay for reparations for slavery? There were only a few thousand slave owners out of millions of people. The vast majority of this nation were people who lived lives of abject poverty, akin to slavery, being in hellish conditions. 20% of this nation is now born abroad. Why should people from Africa or from India or Afghanistan living in this country pay for reparations?
But join up the dots here, Rafe. The money went to the elites. The elites in Britain benefited from this.
Yes,
and I'm not going to just focus on your family, but the Trevelyans, These were the elites who were put in charge of countries.
Not in charge of countries. It's undeniable.
His ancestor was in charge of Ireland in the 1840s and oversaw the famine.
But
these were the elites.
Yes, but what you're confusing are slave-owning families with the wealth of the British nation. You know, Rolls-Royce made fortunes selling cars and had huge houses. No one says that contributed to the British growth of the Industrial Revolution, for example. The reality is, slavery is not, this is not about slavery. If this was really about the issue of slavery and reparations, you would see equal demands being made from Africa, because, of course, we have to remember Africans were being enslaved by other Africans. Europeans weren't going inland. They were purchasing slaves that had been put into bondage by other Africans. There were more Africans held in slavery in Africa than ever crossed over the Atlantic. And when Britain tried to abolish the slave trade, African kingdoms protested because it was so lucrative to them, and they were opposed to it.
Esther, come back to Rafe on what he's been saying there, please.
You know, this notion that somehow some of us are not students of history. My own PhD research is in the history of the international social movement for African reparations in the UK. African kingdoms resisted enslavement. In all oppressed peoples, you do have some collaborators, but you have to look at the wider context. And so this notion that somehow Africans were enslaving each other, you mentioned serfs in Britain. African domestic enslavement was akin to servitude. It did not entail the dehumanization, the killings, the torture, the total denial of humanity that occurred in transatlantic chattel slavery. And that's why we use the term maangamizi, because actually what you're doing is distorting the narrative, as many so-called historians do, because it is about preserving a dominant narrative that is about denying the impact of history today on affected communities. And you yourself gave some of that evidence when you spoke about life expectancy in some of those countries where many Africans were trafficked from. And that is the reality today. This is a stain on humanity. And the movement for repair is not about just giving us some money. That is an enslaver's narrative. It is about transformation of the world order to ensure that this never happens again. And the fact that slavery still occurs today shows us that we have not yet created that world order where anyone's life can be dehumanized in such a way.
Alberto, I want to bring you back in just on the money side of things. Colossal figures your report has come up with. Do you think the future here perhaps is investment in education so that future generations know and understand more about what actually happened?
Well, yes, there are two parts to that. First, the colossal amounts of money are, there's always sticker shock whenever someone reads our report. But it's important to put it in context that these amounts of money represent damages that happened over centuries to millions of people, that over 800 million years of labor were stolen. And that is an objective fact. That doesn't depend on any of our assumptions or our comparisons. Second, what to do with the money. The use of the money is beyond our report, but Judge Robinson, who was one of the sponsors of this report, as you well know, has suggested that a lot of the reparations could be used for education and health efforts that would help close these gaps that are pretty obvious and just some people seem not to want to see.
John, I want to come back to you. Your family are giving £100,000 to Grenada.
That's where we began, yeah, with a contribution from Laura Trevelyan, my cousin, and then we're setting up a charity at the moment, which will we'll get our funds more efficiently over to Grenada.
And what will that money be used for? What would you like to see
At the
happen?
moment, it's mostly educational ventures. So part of the University of West Indies Open Campus Programme, and also for Grenada, which is to work with children, particularly in rural areas, giving them uniforms and bus passes and school books and things like that. But we're looking at other potential other funders that we need, funding organisations we should give money to as well.
A lot of people in Ireland, where I come from, have followed this very, very closely. The name Trevelyan, as you know, still haunts Irish people. What he did, the mismanagement of the famine, 1 million Irish people starved to death in the 1840s.
Yeah.
A lot of Irish people think, you could start closer to home with an apology to the people of Ireland?
Well, there was an interview with Laura, my cousin, with a BBC journalist in Ireland, and certainly we do apologise for what he did, and we're not proud of it at all. What our relation CET Trevelyan did was awful, but he was at that time a member of the government. I mean, he was a civil servant. So actually what he was doing was essentially performing government policy, whereas I think what's different about this conversation about transatlantic chattel slavery is we're talking about business. We're talking about this was a choice that our family got involved. In fact, it was through marriage that money came into. So I think it's quite different. But I take your point that what our relation did in Ireland is something we're not proud of either. But I just wanted to say the reason we're having this conversation is because there is a vacuum that's being created by the fact the government, the king, the big institutions have not engaged with this conversation.
What would you like to say to them now if King Charles is flicking through the TV and he finds Round Table? He's not said, you know, he's hinted at remorse.
As we know, one of the problems King Charles has is that he's only going to do it because he's told to by the government. I would hope that the government would say to him, Charles, you can go and apologise and start to talk to members of the Commonwealth, because there are lots of Commonwealth countries that were involved historically in transatlantic chattel slavery, and start to engage with reparations groups, start to have a conversation. That's what's missing. That's what we're in a vacuum. The authorities are not involved in this conversation.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's scary. They perceive it as being expensive. No one likes to apologise. They see it as being a weakness. They see it as being something that could create lots of expenditure. They know that they've just finished paying off the so-called compensation for the plantation owners, for the owners, and that only finished paying off in 2015. They know it probably won't play well with the electorate. It's a difficult subject, I admit. But at the moment, there is an intellectual vacuum going on. That's why we're having this conversation, I think.
Charles always comes across as a decent man. Do you think deep down this troubles him?
Absolutely. I think you can see it when he talks. I mean, we've seen some speeches he's done recently in Commonwealth countries, and you can see there's a sense of real remorse, but he's just got to take that extra step now, I think.
Rafe, should Charles apologise?
Well, I've said no before. I mean, I think it's just time for the Caribbean nations to abandon this ideology of victimhood. These are successful middle-income countries. Many of them rank above Brazil and Mexico on the UN's Human Development Index. You know, Bayard Rustin was a legendary black civil rights activist and socialist, friend of Martin Luther King. Given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama, he said, if my great-granddaddy picked cotton, he may deserve some money. I didn't pick any cotton. No one owes me anything.
Esther, there's a phrase there, ideology of victimhood. How do you feel about those words?
Well, I don't know who he's speaking about. I'm part of a reparations movement that is about reaffirming our humanity. It is about what we refer to as planet repairs, the nexus between cognitive justice, reparatory justice, and environmental justice. We are engaging with many communities, racialized as white, as Asian heritage, who are engaged in this struggle from below, because we all want change. We are on the precipice of a worldwide climate and ecological crisis, which was intensified by chattel enslavement and colonialism. So this is about fundamental transformation of the world and the world order, which we refer to as Ubuntu Dunia, a repaired world, a repaired humanity. And it has to be built from the pillars of those peoples, all the indigenous peoples of the world who have experienced enslavement, who have experienced colonialism, genocide, war crimes, and terrorism, and continue to experience. And I speak in particular for those African people, because the conversation on reparations began in Africa. And I'm very concerned and disturbed that this has become a Caribbean conversation. This is about African humanity, because African humanity has actually built the world, and our bloodlines run throughout all members of the human family. And our struggle will catalyze the repair of all humanity. So it is a foundational struggle, and it is about the struggle for the survival of our very souls and our life here on planet Earth.
John, my final question to you. Just sum up for me the emotional roller coaster you've been on in recent years, reading more about your terrible ancestors. And I you know, they did terrible things.
They did. They performed crimes against humanity. It has been a roller coaster is a good description of it for me. The last 7 years since I discovered that the family had been involved in transatlantic slavery have been increasingly emotionally building up until we were able to finally, in the last year, during COVID and then coming out of COVID, start to have Zoom meetings with the wider family, which led to us actually going to Grenada, which, as you may imagine, was I'd never been to the Caribbean before. It was a massive moment for me and my family members who were there, and Laura, who I read out the letter with. So it's been huge. It's been life-changing.
You feel it was the right thing to do?
Absolutely. I felt like it was the right thing to do from the beginning. So doing it was definitely felt like the right thing to do.
John, Rafe, Esther and Alberto, that's all we have time for. Thank you. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.